Hey everyone, this is Brown at I Have Brown here, and I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and talk about a couple old school villains from some old school Seagal movies. Yeah, Steven Seagal. So, the thing I noticed about his early movies is that he seemed to, one, be in relatively good shape, and he looked really good breaking limbs and what have you, even though his acting left a lot to be desired, to be perfectly honest. But the best of his movies tended to have villains who really stood out. Whether it be, them just being darkly charismatic or, being so, twistedly evil that, it's like you're wanting them to die, or they just come in and steal the show. So a couple of characters or, actors playing the villains that came to mind were Henry Silva as Seagal in Above the Law, which was a legitimately, decent, crime drama / action movie. And, Seagal was a good villain, as played by Henry Silva, who, excelled at playing villains. The only problem with his character is that he really wasn't in the movie that much. But to be fair, though, I mean, the amount of times that he was in the movie, I mean, you saw just how evil his character was, to the point of, say, he wasn't above having women and, children, tortured and mutilated just to get information, that kind of thing. Really sick piece of crap, and you wanted him to die. So when Seagal, gets his heroic second wind at the climax of that movie and breaks the guy's arm, nose, arm, then neck, you're like, yes! Plus, it's one of the few times that, Seagal was kind of, on the ropes, so to speak. He had been, captured, tortured, and, beaten, that kind of, to a point where he was bloody, that kind of thing, which, definitely wasn't something you saw in other Seagal movies. And so it's like you had that going on, plus you had, the fact that Seagal was so evil that you're wanting, Seagal's character to, get his second wind and go all out on him. You're like, it works. But I just wish his character had been in the movie, more than he was, though. And so, going on to another Seagal movie, Out for Justice, the character of Richie, the main villain in that movie, is played by William Forsythe. I didn't think the movie in and of itself was a particularly good movie, but I will say, though, that William Forsythe did a very good job of playing, a coked out of his mind, criminal who's basically going on a murder binge, killing people left and right, without a care in the world. It's like his character is essentially a death seeker when you get right down to it, and you can pick up bits and pieces of that in the actual movie. But unfortunately, though, it's like a lot of it's focusing on Steven Seagal, who, while he was pretty good and above the law as far as acting goes, after that movie, his acting went from, pretty decent to, and this was a point where, his acting limitations were obvious. Like, he still looked good, in fight scenes, but when it came to stuff beyond the fight scenes, it was just kind of like watching a piece of cardboard acting. I mean, an in-shape piece of cardboard, but still a piece of cardboard. But on the other hand, though, whenever William Forsythe is on the screen, you're just, you're like, my God, this guy's insane, like with the amount of chaos he causes and the people that he kills, without a second thought. And William Forsythe is just one of those actors who, they're very good at playing villains. And so him playing an unhinged villain in an urban environment, wasn't a big stretch. But he definitely did a good job of playing a psycho in that movie. Now, the problem with his character is that when he and Seagal finally come face to face and, fight each other, well, it's not even a fight. Seagal just basically throws him all over the place to a point where he's, bleeding all over. And, I mean, it's fascinating. It's awesome on a very primal sense, but if you're looking for, say, a fight in which there seems to be some, stakes being played for, it's not one of those fights, just because this is Seagal just going postal on a guy who, the best he can do is, try and lunge at him, that kind of thing. And so while William Forsythe did a very good job in playing, a psychotic criminal, who had with a death wish, I mean, it would have been nice if he'd actually been able to, say, put up more of a fight against Seagal's character. And apparently, you know, if you look on IMDb and other sources, they did shoot more scenes with William Forsythe, you know, to basically give his character some background and depth, because apparently, you know, Richie, the character of Richie and Seagal's character knew each other from like way back when they were kids. And so, you know, if maybe they'd had a little bit more, you know, character dynamic with one another, there would have been more tension during, you know, their, you know, climactic brawl, you know, except, I mean, it probably still would have been one side and Seagal would have torn the guy apart. But, I mean, for what it was, I mean, it was an okay movie, but William Forsythe did do a good job as a complete madman. On the other hand, though, when we're getting to, say, you know, the villains who not only have a strong presence, but actually pose a threat, we got two villains that come to mind immediately. We got Screwface, as played by Basil Wallace in Marked for Death, and Stranix, as played by Tommy Lee Jones in Under Siege. And Marked for Death, it's a fascinating movie because, I mean, it is, you know, more or less, you know, your typical, you know, Seagal urban action movie slash crime drama, but it also has elements in the atmosphere of a horror movie as well. And part of that is because the director who made Marked for Death had also done Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, I believe it was called, which is arguably one of the better sequels in the Halloween series. But the director definitely had his horror chops, you know, and some horror cred. And so he kind of, I think, brought that, you know, to, you know, Marked for Death, which definitely made the movie more interesting in a visual sense as well as an atmospheric sense. But a big part of that was because the main villain, Screwface, as played Basil Wallace, is straight up terrifying. And Basil Wallace does a good job in considering that it's literally his first movie. But, I mean, he makes an impression, though. And, you know, there will be times where, you're thinking, okay, this is just an ordinary, you know, if violent human criminal who's very good with theatrics. But then there'll be, you know, moments where you're like, wait a minute, it feels like there's legitimately something supernatural going on here with this guy. And I really liked how they kind of, you know, went back and forth on that, or playing it back and forth, to where you may have felt more strongly in one way, but there was just enough doubt and ambiguity to where, like, or is it the other thing? And I really appreciated that about the movie. And also, while, I mean, I'll admit I'm not an expert on Jamaican dialect, one of the things that I read about the movie was that Basil Wallace, when he was, you know, basically fleshing his character out, and when it came to the writing and what have you, he made a point to, you know, basically incorporate, you know, legitimate, you know, Jamaican dialect, you know, into his, you know, lines, basically to make his characters actually sound Jamaican, you know. And so, I mean, I don't know how it holds up to, say, everyday, you know, Jamaican dialect, but, you know, for the purpose of the movie, I thought it worked, you know. And so, and the other thing that makes him stand out is he's probably, you know, one of the absolute, you know, few characters to give a Steven Seagal, you know, character a legitimate challenge when it comes to a climactic fight scene. And, you know, it's a very brutal scene, you know, as, you know, it should be in a Seagal, you know, movie, but at the same time, it's different in a sense that when it gets to that fight scene at the climax of the movie, it's not just, you know, your typical, you know, Seagal, you know, wading through everyone and hardly taking a punch, you know, like, say, you know, Out for Justice, in which, you know, he just single-handedly, you know, tears William Forsythe apart, without taking any sort of hit. But here, though, like, he's actually on the ropes. Like, Screwface is actually able to put up a fight that, you know, kind of, you know, keeps him, if not evenly grounded, then at the very least, you know, you know, you have there's a sense of, like, okay, I know it's a Seagal movie, he's going to come out on top, but at the same time, Screwface is actually putting up a fight with him. Like, he's actually getting some shots in and throwing him around some, and so you're like, damn. And so, I mean, yeah, it's definitely one of the few fight scenes in a Seagal movie that, you know, you actually have a certain level of suspense in there, even though if you know what's going to happen, or in the sense of Seagal's character coming out on top. You know, Screwface was such a good villain, and they did a good enough job of making him a genuine threat, you know, to where, you know, you're like, you know, you're sort of on the edge of your seat in that regard. But the other villain, Stranix, is played by Tommy Lee Jones from Under Siege. He, you know, is one of those characters who just comes in and literally steals the show. Or I should say, Tommy Lee Jones, you know, came and stole the movie from Steven Seagal, because Steven Seagal's face is on the theatrical poster, but it's Tommy Lee Jones you go away remembering in that movie. And one of the things I loved about Under Siege is, I mean, besides how fun of an action movie it was, kind of like a lot of people have said, it's kind of like a ripoff of Die Hard, like if Die Hard was on a battleship or something. You know, I mean, it's a true description, but then you get to where, you know, the character Stranix, you know, Tommy Lee Jones, you know, just, you know, is so much, you know, larger than life with his character, bringing a lot of energy to him, you know, to a point where it's like his character is very unpredictable, you know, because of how, you know, energetic he is. But at the same time, though, and there'll be a moment where it's like he does a good, like when he's making like demands, you know, from, you know, the government and everything, or the military, like he's, you know, he's deliberately playing, you know, the crazy into persona, you know, basically making, you know, the military thinking that they're dealing with a madman, but it's like he's letting his men know that, you know, hey, it's a joke, we're in on it, they're not, you know, that kind of thing. So it's like a sane guy playing crazy, and Tommy Lee Jones does a good job at that. But there's a part in the movie, though, where basically his plans are going awry. Steven Seagal and, you know, the few members of his makeshift team that he's thrown together are basically, you know, retaking the ship, you know, level by level. You know, Tommy Lee Jones, you know, he basically has, you know, a moment where, you know, as Stranix, he plays Stranix, you know, as having like this serious mental breakdown, and he just kills it. And it's one of those things where it's like, you know, he's launching the missiles and everything, and he's sort of, you know, alternating between singing like a crazy version of, you know, the Star Spangled Banner, and then he's saying, you know, this little piggy cried wee wee wee, you know, and he basically goes back and forth on that, and he's, you know, sort of, you know, sitting back in his chair, sort of just, you know, basking in the chaos of it all. And that's when you realize Stranix is a crazy guy pretending to be sane while pretending to be crazy. Now, you might think that's not a big deal, but from an acting standpoint, that is not an easy task, and Tommy Lee Jones killed it. And so, so you had that for sure. I mean, but then on the other hand, though, he's also like one of the few villains to, if not give Steven Seagal's character, you know, a straight up, I mean, an even fight, he's at least able to put up enough of a challenge to where, you know, the fight's not as much of a one-sided fight, in the sense that he's able to actually last a good amount of time against Seagal's character, and he gets one, you know, cut on him, and it's a knife fight, and it's actually a pretty cool, you know, well-shot knife fight. But unfortunately, though, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, yes, his character actually, you know, lasts a decent amount of time against Seagal's character because they're both military guys, and so some military training definitely comes in handy. But at the same time, though, considering, you know, how badass of a character Stranix is and how well Tommy Lee Jones played him, you're kind of hoping for, I mean, this charismatic villain to put up, or at least, if not put up a better fight, then at the very least, you know, get a few more shots in, or, you know, maybe a few more slashes, because Seagal actually, you know, cuts him up pretty good. And then, of course, you know, you get that bit where he puts his eye out and then, you know, rams his knife into Stranix's skull, right after, of course, you know, Stranix had cut him, like, right there. But then, you know, at the same time, you're like, okay, yeah, Stranix got one cut in, and he lasted longer than most of your other Seagal antagonists, but, you know, you're kind of like, you just wanted him to get a few more shots in, you know. So, anyway, though, yeah, those are the villains that, you know, for me, you know, come to mind as far as, you know, making an impression and being good villains. I mean, say what you will about the movies they were in, but they were good villains, though. So I just wanted to throw out my thoughts there. Anyone got any feedback on that? Who are y'all's favorite, Seagal villains in, his era in which the movies were, halfway decent? Yeah, just give me a shout, drop a line, let me know. Would love to hear from y'all. Y'all have a good day. Take care. Bye.